Spring 1946. The windswept coast of Essex. At the Ordnance Experimental Establishment in Shoeburyness, British engineers stood before a row of captured German weapons laid out like specimens in a museum of war. The smell of gun oil and salt air mixed in the cold breeze. Among the assembled hardware sat several examples of the 2-centimeter Flak 30 and Flak 38, those distinctive light anti-aircraft guns that had filled the skies over Europe with lethal tracers for 6 long years. Their barrels still bore the scorch marks of combat. Their mechanism still carried the dust of battlefields from Norway to North Africa. Now they would face a different kind of test. Not the chaos of war, but the methodical scrutiny of British military science. What these engineers would discover in the weeks ahead would rewrite the technical understanding of one of Germany's most widely deployed weapons. But first, they needed to understand what they were looking at. The 20mm Flak represented one of Germany's answers to a problem that had haunted military planners since aircraft first appeared over the trenches of the Great War. How do you shoot down something moving at hundreds of kilometers per hour? How do you track it, lead it, and deliver enough firepower to bring it crashing from the sky before it drops its bombs or strafes your positions? By the time Hitler's war machine rolled across Poland in 1939, the Germans believed they had found their solution. The Flak 30, introduced in the early 30s, had been refined into the Flak 38 by 1940. These weapons became ubiquitous. You found them mounted on the decks of U-boats surfacing in the Atlantic. You saw them bolted to the beds of Opel Blitz trucks racing across the Russian steppes. They crowned the armored hulls of half-tracks and guarded critical bridges, fuel depots, and command posts across occupied Europe. The distinctive 4-barreled variant, the Flak Vierling, became one of the most feared anti-aircraft systems of the entire war, capable of throwing up a wall of lead that could shred an approaching fighter in seconds. British pilots had learned to respect these guns. Coming in low over a German convoy meant running a gauntlet of 20mm fire that could punch through aluminum skin and rupture fuel lines. American bomber crews on daylight raids watched the black puffs of heavier flak with dread, but it was often the smaller caliber guns, like the 20mm, that inflicted the damage during low-level attacks. The weapon had earned its reputation in blood. Its rate of fire approached 450 rounds per minute in the Flak 38 model, an impressive figure that meant a skilled crew could saturate a cone of airspace with explosive shells. German propaganda had showcased these weapons in newsreels, their crews working with mechanical precision as shell casings rained onto concrete pads and tracers arced into clouded skies. But now the war was over. The guns were silent, and the British engineers at Shoeburyness had a simple mission: find out exactly what made these weapons tick, and more importantly, find out where they failed. The team assembled for this task represented some of the finest technical minds in British ordnance evaluation. These were men who had spent the war years analyzing everything from German tank armor to V-2 rocket components. They approached their work with the dispassion of surgeons and the curiosity of detectives. Each weapon would be disassembled, measured, tested, and pushed to its limits. The goal was not simply to understand German engineering, but to extract lessons that might inform British weapons development in the years ahead. The world had changed. The atomic age had dawned, but conventional weapons still mattered, and understanding what had worked and what had failed in the greatest conflict in human history was considered essential work. So, on that cold spring day, as gulls wheeled overhead and the North Sea rolled against the shingle beaches, the engineers began their examination of the German 20mm Flak. They had no idea what they were about to discover. The first impression the Flak guns made was one of remarkable engineering sophistication. Strip away the wartime context, ignore their purpose, and you were looking at machines of impressive complexity and precision. The British engineers documented every detail. The Flak 38 weighed approximately 420 kilograms in its complete mounting, which included the weapon itself, the tripod or pedestal mount, and the necessary traverse and elevation mechanisms. The gun barrel measured just under 1.3 meters in length, chambered for the 20 by 138 millimeter cartridge that Germany had standardized across multiple weapon systems. This standardization was itself a mark of intelligent design. The same ammunition that fed the Flak guns could be used in aircraft cannon like the MG 151/20, simplifying logistics across the armed forces. The operating mechanism relied on the recoil principle, using a short recoil system that was both compact and relatively efficient. When fired, the barrel and bolt recoiled together for a short distance before the bolt was unlocked and continued rearward, extracting and ejecting the spent case. A return spring then drove the bolt forward, stripping a fresh round from the magazine and chambering it. The cycle repeated as long as the trigger was held and ammunition remained. On paper, this was elegant. In practice, the British engineers noted, it required extraordinarily tight tolerances and careful manufacture. Every component had to fit precisely. Any deviation, anywhere, any contamination could disrupt the delicate ballet of metal moving at high speed under enormous pressure. The magazines themselves drew particular attention. Unlike belt-fed systems, which had become increasingly common in British and American weapons, the German 20mm Flak relied on detachable box magazines holding 20 rounds. The magazines inserted from the left side of the weapon and could be changed relatively quickly by a trained crew. German doctrine called for loaders to keep a steady supply of fresh magazines ready, allowing the gunner to maintain fire during engagements. The engineers at Shoeburyness examined these magazines closely. They were stamped steel construction, with a follower spring that pushed cartridges upward into the feed path. The design was simple in concept, but the execution had to be perfect. Any deformation of the magazine body, any weakening of the spring, any dirt in the feed lips could cause feeding problems. This would become important later. Testing began with basic function checks. The engineers loaded magazines with British-manufactured ammunition of equivalent specifications and fired controlled bursts. The guns performed well initially. The rate of fire was indeed impressive, the recoil manageable, the muzzle report sharp and distinctive. Spent cases ejected cleanly to the right, tumbling through the air and clattering onto the concrete. After each burst, the engineers inspected the weapon, checking for any signs of unusual wear or stress. Everything appeared normal. The German designers had clearly done their homework. These weapons had been used effectively across every theater of the war, from the frozen forests of Finland to the scorching deserts of Libya. They had proved adaptable, reliable under field conditions, and deadly when properly crewed. British intelligence reports had documented countless instances of flak guns downing Allied aircraft or suppressing ground attacks. So where was the weakness? The engineers decided to push harder. The next phase of testing would prove revelatory. The engineers designed a series of endurance trials meant to simulate sustained combat conditions. In real air defense scenarios, a flak gun might need to fire continuously for extended periods as enemy aircraft made repeated passes or as bomber streams flew overhead. How would the weapon perform under such stress? The test protocols called for continuous firing in long bursts, with only brief pauses to change magazines. The goal was to exceed 200 rounds in a single engagement scenario, which represented a realistic upper limit for intense combat. 4 magazines, 80 rounds, then push beyond with additional reloads. fire until something broke, or until the weapon could no longer function. This was stress testing at its most fundamental. The first gun in the series was a Flak 38 captured in France, still bearing Wehrmacht unit markings on its mount. The engineers loaded fresh magazines and began firing. 20 rounds, magazine change, 20 more. The rhythm became mechanical. 40 rounds, 60, 80. The gun was heating up noticeably. The barrel began to shimmer with heat distortion. 100 rounds. The rate of fire remained steady, 120. Then something changed. At approximately 140 rounds, the first jam occurred. The bolt failed to go fully into battery, leaving a round half-chambered. The engineer on the weapon immediately ceased fire and signaled the malfunction. Following safety protocols, they waited, then carefully cleared the action. The unfired round was extracted. The magazine was removed and inspected. Nothing obvious appeared wrong, but the edges of the magazine feed lips showed signs of heat damage. They were slightly warped. The metal had expanded. This was interesting. The engineers noted the details in their logs and prepared to continue testing with a fresh magazine. Firing resumed 20 more rounds, then 30. At approximately 180 rounds total, another stoppage occurred, this time more serious. The bolt locked open but would not close when the trigger was released and pulled again. Manual inspection revealed that the receiver itself had become so hot that dimensional changes were affecting the movement of internal components. Tolerances that had been adequate at normal temperatures were now too tight. Metal had expanded. Clearances had disappeared. The weapon required cooling before it could function again. The engineers let it sit for 20 minutes, then tried again. It worked, but the pattern was clear. Beyond a certain threshold of sustained fire, the weapon's performance degraded rapidly. They tested a second gun with similar results, then a third. Each time the pattern repeated. Under short burst fire, the kind of engagement that might last 30 seconds or a minute, the flak guns performed admirably, but pushed them beyond that. Demand sustained fire for 2 or 3 minutes without pause, and problems emerged. The magazines became the first point of failure. The thin stamped steel bodies absorbed heat from the weapon's receiver and from handling. As they warmed, they deformed slightly. Feed lips bent. The follower spring lost tension. Rounds began to nosedive or misfeed. Even when magazines functioned correctly, the receiver overheating became catastrophic. At temperatures exceeding what the engineers estimated at around 200 degrees Celsius, the weapon would seize. Complete disassembly was required to clear the malfunction and allow the gun to cool sufficiently to resume firing. One of the senior engineers on the testing team, a man named Harrison, who had spent the war evaluating weapons at various establishments across Britain, found this particularly noteworthy. He had seen countless weapons fail under stress testing. That was the point of such trials. But the flak guns failed in a specific way that spoke to fundamental design decisions. They had been optimized for burst fire, for short, sharp engagements, where a gunner would send 20 or 40 rounds toward a passing aircraft, and then pause. They had not been designed for the kind of sustained fire that defensive situations sometimes demanded. Harrison made notes in his evaluation report, his handwriting cramped and precise. He wrote about the feed system's vulnerability. He noted the receiver's tendency to overheat, and in one passage that would later become famous among ordnance historians, he attempted to summarize his findings. The exact wording has been debated, as the original documents were fragmentary, but according to reconstructions based on surviving pages, he wrote something to this effect. The design is formidable, but fragile. Its strength lies in its fire rate, its death in its feed. To understand why these weaknesses mattered, you need to understand the evolution of air defense doctrine during the war. In 1939, when the conflict began, most military planners still thought of anti-aircraft fire in terms of individual engagements. A bomber appears, you shoot at it, it either goes down or it doesn't, and then you wait for the next one. This worked reasonably well during the early war years, when air raids were relatively small and aircraft speeds were modest. A flak crew had time between targets. They could change magazines, let their weapon cool, and prepare for the next engagement. The gun's limitations were rarely tested, but the war evolved. By 1943, Allied air power had grown enormously. Bomber streams over Germany involved hundreds of aircraft. Fighter-bomber attacks on the Eastern Front came in waves. The tempo of air combat increased dramatically. German flak crews found themselves in situations their weapons had not been designed for. Imagine you are manning a 20mm flak position outside Berlin in early 1944. The air raid sirens begin their undulating wail. You and your crew scramble to your gun. The searchlights lance into the darkness. Then they come. Not one bomber, not 5, but dozens, hundreds. A river of aircraft crossing the sky at different altitudes. You begin firing at the first target's tracers arc upward. Your loader slams in magazine after magazine. The gun is shaking, hot, the barrel glowing faintly. You cannot stop. There are more coming, always more coming. And then your weapon jams. The bolt freezes. Your loader is pulling at the magazine, but it is stuck, warped by heat. You are fumbling with the charging handle, trying to clear the malfunction, and overhead the bombers drone on, untouched. This happened thousands of times. German after-action reports from 1943 onwards are filled with complaints about weapon malfunctions during extended engagements. The British engineers at Shoeburyness were quantifying what German soldiers had learned through bitter experience. The flak guns were superb weapons for ideal conditions. Clean them well, use fresh magazines, fire in short bursts, allow cooling time, and they were devastatingly effective. But war rarely provided ideal conditions. In North Africa, sand infiltrated every mechanism. In Russia, temperatures fell so low that lubricants thickened to sludge, and metal became brittle. In France, during the Normandy campaign, constant Allied air superiority meant German flak crews were firing almost continuously at ground attack aircraft. The guns broke, they overheated, they jammed, and men died because their weapons failed at the critical moment. Contrast this with the direction Allied weapons development had taken. The British Oerlikon 20mm cannon, which was itself based on an earlier Swiss design that had influenced German development, had undergone significant modification during the war. British engineers had moved toward drum magazines holding 60 rounds and had improved cooling. American weapons designers had gone further, developing belt-fed systems for many of their 20mm applications, like the Hispano cannon variants used in fighters. Belt feed eliminated the magazine change interval and reduced 1 point of failure. The Americans had also embraced heavier cooling systems and more robust receiver designs that could sustain fire longer. These were incremental improvements, not revolutionary changes, but they reflected different design philosophies. The Germans had prioritized precision and rate of fire. The Allies had prioritized endurance and reliability. In a long war of attrition, endurance won. The engineers at Shoeburyness compiled extensive data. They measured temperatures. They photographed warped magazines. They documented jamming patterns and calculated mean rounds between failures under various conditions. The report they would eventually produce ran to dozens of pages, dense with technical specifications and test data. But the core finding was simple. The German 20mm flak guns, for all their sophistication, had a fatal flaw. They could not sustain prolonged fire without failure. This was not a minor inconvenience. In air defense, sustained fire was often the difference between downing an attacker and watching it escape to strike again. The British had found the weakness in what many had considered one of Germany's most successful weapons designs. But what did this really mean for history? Numbers on test reports cannot capture what these technical failures meant to the men who depended on these weapons. Consider the experience of a typical German flak crew in the final years of the war. By 1944, Germany was desperately short of experienced soldiers. Many flak positions were manned by teenagers, by older men of the Volkssturm, by Luftwaffe ground personnel with minimal anti-aircraft training. They received their weapons, often used and poorly maintained, along with whatever ammunition could be spared. They were told to defend a railway junction, a fuel depot, a bridge, whatever target the Allies might strike from the air, and they waited. When the attack came, it came fast. Allied fighter bombers by 1944 were experienced, aggressive, and well-armed. They knew how to suppress flak positions. They came in low, used terrain masking, and concentrated fire on anyone shooting back. A flak crew had seconds to engage. You saw the aircraft, a Typhoon or a Thunderbolt, coming in at treetop level. You traversed the gun, led the target, and opened fire. The weapon roared. Tracers reached out. Maybe you scored hits. Maybe you saw strikes on the aircraft's wings. But then there was another one, and another. You kept firing. The magazine ran dry. Your loader scrambled for a fresh one. It jammed. The feed lips were bent. You were screaming at him to hurry. The aircraft was firing back. You heard the terrible ripping sound of heavy machine guns, saw the earth erupting in geysers of dirt and stone. Someone was hit. Your loader was down. You grabbed for a magazine yourself, trying to force it into the receiver. It would not seat properly. The aircraft flashed overhead. You heard the whoosh of rockets leaving their rails. The target, whatever you were defending, erupted in flame, and your gun was still jammed. This was not hypothetical. Allied combat reports from 1944 and 1945 frequently noted light flak that stopped firing mid-engagement. Intelligence officers assumed the guns had been destroyed or their crews killed. Sometimes that was true, but other times, as post-war interviews with captured German flak crews revealed, the guns had simply malfunctioned. One veteran, interviewed by American historians in 1946, described his experience during the Battle of the Bulge. His 4-gun flak position was tasked with protecting a fuel dump near Bastogne. On the second day of the offensive, Allied fighter bombers found them. He remembered firing until his gun seized. He remembered watching helplessly as the other 3 guns in his position all jammed within minutes of each other. He remembered the fuel dump burning, the screams of wounded men, the feeling of absolute helplessness as aircraft circled overhead, and his weapon, his only defense, was a useless piece of overheated metal. These experiences were multiplied across thousands of positions and millions of rounds fired. The German flak arm had begun the war with confidence and excellent equipment. They had ended it exhausted, undersupplied, and increasingly aware that their weapons had limitations. Their enemies had learned to exploit. Allied pilots learned that if they could force a flak position to sustain fire, it would often stop on its own. Suppression tactics evolved. Make multiple passes, keep them shooting. Their guns will fail before ours do. This was brutal calculus, but it worked. The technical weakness the British engineers had documented at Shoeburyness had played out in countless deadly engagements. Across Europe, men had died because of feed system design and receiver tolerances. War reduced everything to such grim equations. Why had German engineers designed the flak guns this way? Understanding the decisions made in the 1930s requires understanding the context of that era's military thinking. When the Flak 30 was first developed in the early 30s, aircraft speeds were much lower. Most bombers cruised around 250 to 300 kilometers per hour. Fighters were faster, but not dramatically so. Engagements were expected to be brief. An attacking aircraft would be visible for perhaps 15 to 20 seconds before either passing out of range or being hit. Under these assumptions, a weapon that could deliver 150 rounds per minute with very high accuracy made perfect sense. The magazine feed system kept the weapon light and allowed for easy ammunition handling. The emphasis on precision manufacturing ensured that each round went where it was aimed. German military doctrine also emphasized quality over quantity in many weapons systems. This was partly practical, as Germany lacked some of the raw material resources of its enemies, and partly cultural, reflecting a tradition of craftsmanship and engineering excellence. German weapons were often beautifully made, precisely machined, sophisticated in operation. This had advantages. It meant that when they worked superbly, but it also meant they were often difficult to manufacture, difficult to maintain, and vulnerable to the inevitable degradation that combat inflicted on all equipment. The contrast with Soviet design philosophy was stark. Soviet weapons were often crude by comparison, with loose tolerances and simple mechanisms, but they worked in mud, in dust, in temperatures that would freeze German weapons solid. The Soviets had learned that reliability mattered more than precision. The Germans never fully absorbed that lesson. The Flak guns embodied this philosophical divide. They were precision instruments expected to be maintained by skilled crews in relatively controlled conditions. Even in combat, German military culture emphasized proper procedure, regular maintenance, and disciplined operation. Crews were trained to clean their weapons daily, to inspect magazines for damage, to follow strict firing discipline. When these conditions obtained, the guns performed well, but as the war dragged on and Germany's situation deteriorated, such conditions became rare. Crew quality declined as casualties mounted and training programs were shortened. Maintenance suffered as spare parts became scarce. Operating conditions worsened as the Wehrmacht fought in increasingly desperate circumstances. The gap between the weapons' design assumptions and battlefield reality widened to a chasm. British engineers, examining these weapons in the peace and quiet of Shoeburyness, could see all this clearly. Their reports noted not just the technical weaknesses, but the broader implications. One section of the evaluation discussed the differences between German and British design approaches. British weapons, the report observed, tended to sacrifice some peak performance for greater robustness. They accepted slightly lower rates of fire in exchange for better sustained fire capability. They used heavier components that were less prone to heat-related failure. They designed for the average soldier, not the expert. This reflected Britain's different industrial base and different military experience. The British Empire had fought colonial wars for a century, conflicts where weapons needed to work in every climate and condition imaginable. Maintained by soldiers with varying levels of training and skill, British design incorporated these lessons. The Germans, with their emphasis on European warfare and highly trained professional forces, had made different choices. Neither approach was inherently wrong, but the long grinding war of 1939 to 1945 favored reliability over precision. The British engineers did not test the Flak guns in isolation. Their facility at Shoeburyness had examples of comparable weapons from other nations. They conducted parallel tests on the British Oerlikon, on captured Italian Breda guns, even on American weapons that had been sent for evaluation. The comparative data was revealing. In burst fire tests, where weapons fired 20 to 40 rounds, and then paused for magazine changes or cooling, The German flak guns actually outperformed most competitors. Their rate of fire was higher, their accuracy was excellent, and their handling characteristics were generally praised. German elevation and traverse mechanisms were smooth and well-balanced, allowing gunners to track targets effectively. In short engagements, the Flak was arguably the best light anti-aircraft gun anyone had fielded during the war. But in sustained fire tests, the rankings reversed dramatically. The British Oerlikon, with its larger drum magazine and more robust receiver, could maintain fire significantly longer before experiencing heat-related failures. Its rate of fire was lower, around 320 rounds per minute, compared to the Flak's 450, but it could sustain that rate for extended periods. The engineers recorded instances where the Oerlikon fired continuously for 5 minutes, well over 1,000 rounds, before requiring cooling. When it did overheat, the failure mode was gradual rather than catastrophic. The rate of fire would slow, but the weapon remained operational. You could still shoot. You might not hit much, but you could keep firing. The German guns just stopped. American weapons showed similar patterns, though with different characteristics. American designers had moved aggressively toward heavy barrel designs and belt feed systems. These weapons were bulky and often criticized for being over-engineered, but they had enormous endurance. An American 20mm cannon mounted on a destroyer could fire essentially unlimited ammunition with proper barrel changes. Even ground-based weapons like the various 50-caliber machine gun systems the Americans fielded showed this design philosophy. Accept more weight, accept more complexity, but gain the ability to maintain fire indefinitely. In defensive scenarios, this was invaluable. You could put up a wall of fire and keep it there. Attackers could not wait you out because your guns would not fail. The implications for post-war British weapons development were clear. The evaluation reports recommended incorporating lessons from both German and American designs. Take the German emphasis on accuracy and initial rate of fire, but combine it with American-style robustness and sustained fire capability. British weapons programs in the late 1940s and 1950s reflected this synthesis. New anti-aircraft systems emphasized reliability and endurance while attempting to maintain high performance. The technical intelligence gathered at facilities like Shoeburyness fed directly into design decisions that shaped British armaments for decades. In this sense, the German flak guns taught the British what not to do, which was perhaps as valuable as any lesson they might have taught about successful design. It was during the final stages of testing, after the main evaluation work had been completed, that the engineers at Shoeburyness made an unexpected discovery that would add a new dimension to their understanding of the flak guns. A researcher named Thompson, a specialist in metallurgy who had been examining wear patterns on the tested weapons, noticed something odd about one particular Flak 38. This gun, captured near Hamburg in the final weeks of the European War, showed unusual modifications. Someone had machined the receiver to increase internal clearances. The magazine well had been slightly widened. The weapon's serial numbers indicated it had been manufactured in late 1944, but these modifications appeared to be field expedient changes made after manufacture. Thompson brought this to the attention of the test director. Together they examined the weapon more closely. The modifications were crude but effective. Whoever had made them understood the overheating problem and had attempted to compensate by allowing more clearance for thermal expansion. It was ingenious in its way, a battlefield fix for a design flaw, but it raised questions. How widespread was awareness of this problem among German forces? Had there been official guidance on modifications? Or was this the work of one clever armorer trying to keep his unit's guns functional? The team decided to examine the other captured weapons more carefully. To their surprise, they found that nearly half of the late-war flak guns showed some form of modification. Most were crude, some were quite sophisticated. This discovery changed their understanding of the evaluation. The Germans had not been blind to these problems. They had known. At the unit level, the soldiers and technicians who worked with these weapons daily had recognized the overheating and feed issues. They had tried to fix them within the constraints of field conditions and limited resources. Some modifications seemed to help. The widened magazine wells reduced feed jams, though at the cost of looser fit and potential accuracy, degradation increased receiver clearances allowed the weapons to function at higher temperatures, though reliability still suffered. What the British engineers were seeing was not just a design flaw, but evidence of a desperate attempt to compensate for that flaw under wartime conditions. This led to a broader investigation. The British had captured thousands of pages of German technical documents. Intelligence teams were still working through the material, translating and cataloguing at the request of the Shoeburyness team. A search was made for any German documentation related to flak gun modifications or known deficiencies. What emerged was fragmentary but telling. A technical bulletin from 1943 acknowledged overheating issues in sustained fire and recommended limiting bursts to 30 rounds with pauses for cooling. A field report from an air defense unit in France complained about magazine feed failures in dusty conditions. A memo from a manufacturing facility discussed attempts to improve heat treatment of receiver components to better resist thermal stress. The Germans had not been ignorant. They had simply been unable or unwilling to completely redesign the weapon system in the middle of a war. This revelation transformed the British evaluation from a simple technical assessment into something more nuanced. The German flak guns were not badly designed. They were brilliantly designed for one set of conditions, but those conditions increasingly failed to match battlefield reality as the war progressed. The Germans had recognized this and had attempted various fixes, but none had addressed the fundamental issue. The weapons had been optimized for a kind of warfare that no longer existed by 1943, and retooling production to create an entirely new weapon would have required resources Germany did not have. So they soldiered on with what they had, making incremental improvements, teaching crews to work around the limitations, and accepting that their weapons would sometimes fail at critical moments. It was a very human story of engineering compromise and wartime expedience. The final evaluation report on the German 20mm flak guns was completed in autumn 1946 and classified for several years before being released to the broader British defense establishment. By then, the world had moved on. The dawn of jet aircraft and guided missiles was already making guns like the flak seem obsolete. But the lessons documented in that report proved influential beyond their immediate technical content. They became case studies in weapons evaluation, teaching generations of engineers about the importance of sustained fire capability, thermal management, and designing for realistic battlefield conditions rather than ideal testing scenarios. In Germany itself, the flak guns passed into history, along with the regime that had deployed them. Some were retained by occupying forces for training and evaluation, many were scrapped. A few ended up in museums, silent artifacts of a defeated military machine. The soldiers who had crewed them scattered to rebuild lives in a devastated country. Few spoke publicly about their war experiences in those early years, but decades later, as Germany reckoned with its past and oral history projects sought out veterans, some of those old flak crews told their stories, and repeatedly they mentioned the guns jamming. They remembered the frustration, the fear, the helplessness when weapons failed. The British engineers who conducted the tests moved on to other projects. Harrison, the senior evaluator who had written so eloquently about the Flak's fragility, went on to work on early guided missile programs before retiring in the 1960s. Thompson, the metallurgist who had discovered the field modifications, became a professor and wrote several textbooks on material science. None of them saw their work on the Flak evaluation as their most important contribution. It was simply one project among many in long careers, but the thorough documentation they produced ensured that the lessons learned would not be forgotten. Military archives preserved the data. Defense contractors consulted the reports when designing new weapons. The knowledge propagated. In a broader sense, the Flak gun evaluation represented something significant about the nature of technological competition in warfare. It demonstrated that excellence in one area, like rate of fire, could not compensate for deficiency in another, like sustained operation. It showed that precision engineering, while admirable, was not always optimal for military applications where reliability mattered more than perfection, and it illustrated how design decisions made in peacetime, based on assumptions about how wars would be fought, could prove catastrophically wrong when reality intruded. The Germans had built beautiful weapons based on their doctrine and expectations. The British and Americans had built cruder weapons based on different assumptions. When tested by the furnace of actual combat, the cruder weapons often proved superior because they better matched the chaos and degradation of real battlefields. This was a lesson that transcended the specific case of 20mm anti-aircraft guns. It applied to tanks, where German designs were often superior in armor and firepower, but inferior in reliability and ease of maintenance. It applied to aircraft, where German jets were technological marvels that suffered from engine failures and fuel shortages. It applied to the entire German war effort, which had often prioritized sophistication over mass production and battlefield practicality. The British engineers at Shoeburyness had documented one small piece of this larger pattern. Their work on the Flak guns was a footnote in the vast literature of World War II technical intelligence, but it was a revealing footnote, one that captured essential truths about technology, war, and human limitations. As the engineers at Shoeburyness prepared to close their evaluation program on German weapons and move on to other projects, they compiled summary statistics that provided a sobering perspective on the Flak gun story. During the war, Germany had manufactured approximately 100,000 Flak 30 and Flak 38 weapons in various configurations. These guns had been deployed on every front, from the Arctic to North Africa, from the Atlantic Wall to the gates of Moscow. They had fired hundreds of millions of rounds at Allied aircraft. Allied loss records suggested that light flak, including but not limited to 20mm systems, had been responsible for thousands of aircraft destroyed or damaged. The weapons had been effective despite their flaws. But the question lingered: how much more effective might they have been without those flaws? The engineers attempted some rough calculations. If overheating and feed problems had reduced German flak effectiveness by even 20% in sustained engagements, how many additional Allied aircraft might have been lost? The numbers were chilling from one perspective, reassuring from another. Every aircraft that survived a flak engagement because a gun had jammed represented lives saved. Allied aircrew casualties had been horrific even with German weapons malfunctioning. If those weapons had been more reliable, the cost of air superiority might have been even higher. This was the cold arithmetic of war. Technical failures in enemy weapons were victories measured in lives. In Germany itself, the flak guns passed into history, along with the regime that had deployed them. Some were retained by occupying forces for training and evaluation, many were scrapped. A few ended up in museums, silent artifacts of a defeated military machine. The soldiers who had crewed them scattered to rebuild lives in a devastated country. Few spoke publicly about their war experiences in those early years, but decades later, as Germany reckoned with its past and oral history projects sought out veterans, some of those old Flak crews told their stories, and repeatedly they mentioned the guns jamming. They remembered the frustration, the fear, the helplessness when weapons failed. The British engineers who conducted the tests moved on to other projects. Harrison, the senior evaluator who had written so eloquently about the Flak's fragility, went on to work on early guided missile programs before retiring in the 1960s. Thompson, the metallurgist who had discovered the field modifications, became a professor and wrote several textbooks on material science. None of them saw their work on the Flak evaluation as their most important contribution. It was simply one project among many in long careers, but the thorough documentation they produced ensured that the lessons learned would not be forgotten. Military archives preserved the data. Defense contractors consulted the reports when designing new weapons. The knowledge propagated. In a broader sense, the Flak gun evaluation represented something significant about the nature of technological competition in warfare. It demonstrated that excellence in one area, like rate of fire, could not compensate for deficiency in another, like sustained operation. It showed that precision engineering, while admirable, was not always optimal for military applications where reliability mattered more than perfection, and it illustrated how design decisions made in peacetime, based on assumptions about how wars would be fought, could prove catastrophically wrong when reality intruded. The Germans had built beautiful weapons based on their doctrine and expectations. The British and Americans had built cruder weapons based on different assumptions. When tested by the furnace of actual combat, the cruder weapons often proved superior because they better matched the chaos and degradation of real battlefields. This was a lesson that transcended the specific case of 20mm anti-aircraft guns. It applied to tanks, where German designs were often superior in armor and firepower, but inferior in reliability and ease of maintenance. It applied to aircraft, where German jets were technological marvels that suffered from engine failures and fuel shortages. It applied to the entire German war effort, which had often prioritized sophistication over mass production and battlefield practicality. The British engineers at Shoeburyness had documented one small piece of this larger pattern. Their work on the Flak guns was a footnote in the vast literature of World War II technical intelligence, but it was a revealing footnote, one that captured essential truths about technology, war, and human limitations. As the engineers at Shoeburyness prepared to close their evaluation program on German weapons and move on to other projects, they compiled summary statistics that provided a sobering perspective on the Flak gun story. During the war, Germany had manufactured approximately 100,000 Flak 30 and Flak 38 weapons in various configurations. These guns had been deployed on every front, from the Arctic to North Africa, from the Atlantic Wall to the gates of Moscow. They had fired hundreds of millions of rounds at Allied aircraft. Allied loss records suggested that light flak, including but not limited to 20mm systems, had been responsible for thousands of aircraft destroyed or damaged. The weapons had been effective despite their flaws. But the question lingered: how much more effective might they have been without those flaws? The engineers attempted some rough calculations. If overheating and feed problems had reduced German flak effectiveness by even 20% in sustained engagements, how many additional Allied aircraft might have been lost? The numbers were chilling from one perspective, reassuring from another. Every aircraft that survived a flak engagement because a gun had jammed represented lives saved. Allied aircrew casualties had been horrific even with German weapons malfunctioning. If those weapons had been more reliable, the cost of air superiority might have been even higher. This was the cold arithmetic of war. Technical failures in enemy weapons were victories measured in lives. From the German perspective, the cost of these design flaws was incalculable. Every time a flak gun jammed at a critical moment, it represented not just a wasted opportunity to shoot down an attacker, but a potential catastrophe for whatever that attacker was targeting. The bombers that got through, because guns failed, dropped their ordnance on factories, rail yards, cities, and soldiers. The fighter bombers that escaped suppressive fire went on to strafe columns, bomb positions, and deny freedom of movement to German forces. Reliable air defense might not have changed the war's outcome, but it certainly would have made Allied air operations costlier and more difficult. The flak gun's weaknesses, documented so thoroughly by British engineers in the peace that followed, had been exploited in blood during the war itself. There was also a personal dimension to this accounting. Every weapon represented human lives tangentially. The designers who had created the flak guns in the 1930s had been talented engineers working to the best of their knowledge, and within their constraints, they had not set out to create flawed weapons. They had made reasonable choices based on reasonable assumptions. That those assumptions proved incorrect under the stress of total war was not really their fault. War has a way of exposing every weakness, finding every flaw, punishing every misjudgment with deadly efficiency. The men who had designed these guns had mostly been trying to serve their country as they understood that duty. That their country was Nazi Germany complicated moral judgments, but at the technical level, they had simply been engineers doing engineering work. Similarly, the crews who had manned these guns had mostly been ordinary soldiers and airmen doing their jobs. Some had been committed Nazis. Many had not been. They had found themselves in positions, handed weapons, and told to shoot at aircraft. When those weapons failed, they experienced frustration and fear, regardless of ideology. The technical evaluation conducted at Shoeburyness, for all its clinical precision, documented human experiences. Behind every data point about overheating and jamming was a young man desperately trying to clear a malfunction while aircraft bore down on his position. Behind every statistic about sustained fire failure was a crew watching helplessly as their defensive fire ceased at the moment it was most needed. The engineers documenting these failures in their reports were, perhaps unknowingly, writing the obituaries of weapons that had both killed and failed to protect thousands of men. It was not until 1952, 6 years after the British evaluation of German flak guns, that the story took its final turn. A retired Wehrmacht officer contacted the War Office with a cache of wartime documents, including a 1943 German assessment of flak performance. Its conclusions matched the British findings at Shoeburyness: feed system flaws, overheating, and limitations in sustained fire. The Germans had known their engineers had even proposed fixes, a belt-fed version, a redesigned receiver, but the Wehrmacht, starved of resources and under constant bombing, could not retool production. The guns worked well enough, and good enough was all that wartime Germany could afford. The report was shelved. This discovery reshaped the historical view. The Germans had not been ignorant but constrained, aware of flaws yet unable to act. Even the field modifications the British found were semi-official, fixes circulated informally among technical personnel. Admitting such problems publicly would have hurt morale and procurement credibility. The retired Oberst said he came forward because truth mattered. Technical history, he argued, should reflect complexity, not myth. Once verified, his documents entered the historical record and became a case study in how organizations handle known problems under pressure. The Flak story became less about national genius or failure, and more about engineers and soldiers trapped in a war economy that demanded compromise. It also influenced post-war design philosophy. Western militaries learned to prioritize reliability under stress over peak performance. Lessons visible in 1950s NATO weapons. The Soviets, who had long favored rugged practicality, embodied the opposite lesson in the AK-47, simple, reliable, unstoppable. By the 1970s, veterans from both sides were meeting and comparing experiences. One former RAF pilot and a German gunner realized they had faced each other in 1944, the pilot surviving because the gun had jammed. Each learned something profound, that their fates had hinged not on skill or luck alone, but on engineering decisions made years earlier. The Flak story became a lasting lesson in balancing perfection with practicality. It showed that true strength lies not in flawlessness, but in endurance under stress. The guns are gone, but their records remain, a reminder that even failure teaches, and the best endure when all